Hello, I'm Elizabeth Shepherd from University College London. I am honoured and delighted to have been invited to speak to you today as part of the celebrations by the Government of Jamaica Archives and Records Department in the Records and Information Management Month 2023 around the theme Reigniting a Nation for Greatness, Managing and Preserving the Records of Our Nation. I'm sorry not to be with you in person, but very happy to be able to join you remotely. I have been asked to give a perspective from the North on the topic of records and information management and nation building. I am speaking from London in the UK, and my experience is mainly based on English record-keeping legislative and regulatory frameworks. I am a white female academic who works in an Anglophone university in London. I can only speak for myself, drawing on my own experience and background. I do not seek to represent the views of others. I have been privileged over the past 30 years to teach students from around the world who have attended UCL to study for their master's programme in Records and Archives Management, or for their doctoral thesis in Information Studies. We welcome students from every country, and over the years, students from East and West Africa, North and South America, the Caribbean, Asia, as well as the continent of Europe have studied in my department. It is enormously enriching for me to have been able to meet and work with them, and wonderful to see our graduates return to their home countries to employ their new skills and knowledge for public and social benefit. As well as teaching and supervising students, I have undertaken research in the broad field of archives, records and information management. And it is this experience on which I will draw today to highlight some themes, which I hope will suggest ways in which the discipline and profession of information management enables a nation to build a more equitable and socially just society for all. I will reflect on three areas of my research, which I think point to key records management contributions to society. First, I will talk about the legislative framework which supports the preservation and provides access to records in the UK, especially our experience of the Freedom of Information legislation and the General Data Protection Regulation, and how this legislation can be supported and enabled by records managers. Secondly, I will discuss the impact of open government data policies and practices, and the approaches and concerns about access to government administrative data, which in some cases are replacing more traditional record formats as evidence of the business of government. Lastly, I will seek to bring a human focus back to records questions by thinking about the people whose lives are captured in records and who, as citizens, information managers are seeking to serve. Throughout the talk, I will draw on research carried out by me and co-researchers at UCL. Over the past 20 years in the UK, the legislative framework governing access to records and information has changed significantly. We have a long-standing Public Records Act dating from 1958, which enshrines the obligation of government to preserve public records, arrange for their transfer to the National Archives, where they will be made available for public access, and to authorise the destruction of records no longer needed. In the 21st century, political rhetoric in the UK, as in many democratic states, has made much of the need to increase public participation in the political process, to improve public understanding of and re-establish public trust and confidence in government decision-making, to increase transparency, openness and accountability of public authorities, and ultimately to produce better government decision-making on behalf of citizens. Many national governments accept the concept of access to information or freedom of information and have introduced legislation to enact this. In the year 2000, the UK Freedom of Information Act was passed into law. The Act imposes significant duties and responsibilities on all public authorities to give access to current information, not only archival records. To achieve this, public authorities need to know what information they hold, to manage and retrieve information effectively, and to deal expeditiously, usually within 20 days, with freedom of information requests. The Lord Chancellor's Code of Practice on the Management of Records, published in compliance with the Act, outlined ways to meet these obligations. As part of the UK's modernising government agenda and the implementation of e-government, which set a target of making all government services available electronically by 2005, freedom of information was a significant part of the wider government agenda to increase openness, transparency, trust and accountability. Progress on e-government reforms tended to be rather slow and focused on technological changes, such as providing access to information via the website, somewhat neglecting the social dimensions to technological change, the institutional context and organisational structures, and rarely implementing holistic reform to information management systems. However, the impact of information policy and freedom of information on public services and the effectiveness of public authorities in meeting their obligations are significant factors in the accountability of government to its citizens. In 2009, my colleagues and I undertook a study of the impact of freedom of information on records managers, mainly in UK local government, and the ways in which information management could help to fulfil the obligations of the Act. We found that whilst most interviewees agreed that FOI had given records management a higher profile and decreased awareness of it as a corporate function, there were few tangible examples of records management being directly transformed or of more resources being given to develop records systems. One records manager said, "We are more high profile, but the actual way we do things hasn't changed." Some expressed concerns that there was a disconnection between information management systems designed for internal processes and their ability to help locate information needed in response to public requests. In the UK, national records management leadership is a responsibility of the Cabinet Office, one of the most important ministerial departments, which supports the Prime Minister and ensures the effective running of government, working with the National Archives. Around the world, national bodies such as JARD play an essential role in this endeavour. Further reforms came with the legislative frameworks concerning data and information privacy, came with the European General Data Protection Regulations, GDPR, which were enacted in the UK Data Protection Act 2018. GDPR relates to processing by any organisation of personal data of individuals. In other jurisdictions, such regulations are labelled as privacy laws. The UK law sets out 7 key principles: lawfulness, fairness and transparency, purpose limitation, data minimisation, accuracy, storage limitation, integrity and security, and accountability. It also provides 8 information rights for individuals, such as the right to be informed, the right of access, the right to rectification, the right to erasure, the right to restrict processing. Record keepers play a role in all of these, and their skills are essential in ensuring that individual information rights are properly respected. Between these 3 pieces of legislation, National Archives, freedom of information, data protection, the UK has a reasonably good balance of legislative and regulatory protections for information and records, providing for their preservation and for public access, whether through archival access to closed records or freedom of information and subject access requests to current information. There is some independent oversight, especially through the regulator, the Information Commissioner, who upholds information rights in the public interest across a range of legislation. There are still gaps in the system, especially around archives and records of local government, and there are significant resource constraints everywhere which limit what record keepers can do. However, a strong legislative framework and regulatory compliance around the creation, preservation, and provision of access to records and information is a cornerstone of an accountable democracy in a nation. Secondly, I want to talk about more recent changes in the format and the management of evidence of government decision-making and the execution of public policy. I am thinking here of the use of administrative data rather than unstructured records to document the business of government, and the accessibility of government data, sometimes as open data, to researchers. Administrative data are data collected by government departments as part of their day-to-day activities, routinely gathered when registering people or events such as births, marriages, and deaths, to regulate the flow of goods or people across borders, to administer benefits such as pensions or obligations like taxation. Data can be found in health records, vehicle licensing, tax, and social security systems. It is different from statistical data collected during a national census or survey. Increasingly, administrative data compiled into data sets are replacing traditional records for documenting citizen interaction with the state. The UK government increasingly frames data as an asset, and the potential benefits in administrative data can be exploited by sharing and linking across data sets. The public good in reusing data to increase government efficiency and for research is set against the public good in protecting privacy. Privacy is a collective as well as an individual benefit, enabling the public to participate confidently in citizen-state interactions. Balancing these benefits is challenging, given rapidly evolving technologies such as volume of storage, faster information retrieval and processing. And in data science, that is more powerful statistical techniques, algorithms, hyperlinking, and AI, which have led to increasingly powerful means to collect, manage, combine, analyze, and derive insight from data. Administrative data is usually related to a person and may also be confidential or sensitive, so requires to be managed under GDPR. However, pseudonymized and de-identified data can be extremely valuable for research into a range of social, political, and economic questions. Increasingly, governments make anonymized data sets available for research, either under secure data harbor conditions or as publicly accessible open data sets. Open government data is a worldwide movement to open up government and public administration data in both human and machine-readable formats for reuse by civil society, economy, media, and academia, as well as by politicians and public administrators. Record keepers may not have the technical computer science skills to manage administrative data, but we do bring social science questions to bear. In 2015 to 17, a group of archival science researchers, led by myself at UCL, investigated questions of trust, consent, and risk around government administrative data. We found that questions of trust were central to citizens' willingness to let governments create, collect, and preserve data, and to strike the right balance between public goods in sharing administrative data across and beyond government. For those with responsibility for advising the government on policy in this area, the importance of securing public trust is well understood, and gaining trust from data subjects and broader society is essential in government data sharing initiatives. Archival definitions of trust are rooted in the record as object and have traditionally revolved around the question of what makes records trustworthy, showing that the record is what it purports to be, authenticity, and free from corruption and tampering, reliability. Public trust in reliability and authenticity depends on the record having adequate conditions of custody through the twin notions of trusted custodian and trusted repository. The three-way relationship between trusted data, trusted custodian, and trusted repository is what Heather McNeil describes as a central trope in archival science. However, the fluid nature of digital data, their dynamism and multiplicity, asks us to focus not on the digital record as an object, but on how trust operates in relational models. Administrative data requires us to think about human relationships. Trust then becomes a relational social construct. It supports the shared goodwill between parties in society, such as citizens and their governments, through an awareness of reciprocal duties and obligations. Across our case studies, researchers who used government administrative data over a long period of years spoke of a shift in the nature of the relationships underpinning their access to government administrative data sets. Previously, access depended on building up strong one-to-one relationships with key gatekeepers in government departments, which was increasingly being replaced with standardized impersonal mechanisms for government data access. Anthony Giddens suggests that the rise of modern abstract systems is a feature of an increasingly globalized world, where traditional patterns of local face-to-face interactions have given way to increasingly distant relationships with absent others in abstract systems. Actors interact with the automated system rather than through personal contact. A complex legislative and regulatory environment with oversight mechanisms managing data quality, security, and use governs the relationship over traditional relational bonds. As a result, public trust in a faceless government is hard to establish and easy to lose. We examined this in the health data setting, which has suffered critical media coverage over accidental data loss by the National Health Service, or when patient data is shared with commercial companies without individual consent. Honora O'Neill identified one response to this in her phrase, the audit explosion, or the audit culture. This is exemplified in the rise of information governance in institutional contexts as a system of monitoring to control risk and increase accountability. The question raised by O'Neill is vital. Do these measures have any impact on securing or maintaining trust, since no system can entirely remove the risk of data loss? No matter how tightly regulated, controlled, secure, and audited the system is, human error or human deviance will emerge. Thinking then about ways of generating public trust in government data, we found that transparency over the purposes of a transaction, the processes that underpin it, the safeguards surrounding it, and transparency over data flows, systems, and programs all enhanced public trust in government data use. Providing clearly documented questions and answers, expressed in everyday language, proactive public engagement such as citizens' panels, and enabling conversations with citizens around complex data issues were all helpful. Transparency is a starting point for enabling a common approach between experts and citizens to shape the boundaries of what is socially acceptable in data use. Shaping these boundaries then enables the development of adequate safeguards, checks, and balances from which the trustworthiness of the processes can be established and scrutinized. Relational models, which might help us to understand administrative data, become even more important in my final topic, which is about human-centred record keeping. Nation building should be for and about the citizens and their lives, and not just about regulation, legislation, national archives, and government data in the abstract. A recent research project at UCL sought to bring back the focus of record keeping to the people whose lives are captured in official records, putting their voices at the centre of the conversation. The Mirror project, Memory, Identity, Rights in Records, Access, is a collaborative research project which explored information rights in child social care in England. Care leavers are adults who were in out-of-home care as children, such as in public authority care, foster care, or children's homes. The Mirror project brought together care leavers, academics, social workers, and information professionals, and the findings argue for a fundamental shift towards participatory, human-centred record-keeping approaches. Mirror builds on other multidisciplinary research, supporting the information rights of marginalised communities, and considers how records are created, managed, activated, and reimagined by multiple agents through time. In family settings, photographs and memory objects, stories, document children's milestones, and support narratives of identity and belonging. Archives give families access to shared relational histories and values. But looked after children often lack such narratives, especially where their childhood has been complex, disrupted, or traumatic. This discoherence can have negative impacts on their sense of worth and belonging. Mirror research showed that care records are critical to care experienced people's sense of identity and memory. In the absence of family records, they turn to records created about them by social workers and care providers, so-called corporate parents, to reconstruct personal histories. Looked after children are extensively scrutinised and documented, producing detailed official care files, observations, reports, assessments, and plans. These organisational records contain looked after children's personal histories. However, care leavers are only able to request access to these files by using the Data Protection Act Subject Access Request provision. Thousands of such requests are made in England each year to local authorities, charities, schools, and the health service. But many care leavers find their files are either missing or heavily redacted, with passages blanked out. When care leavers obtain access to their records, they are confronted with the product of a bureaucratised abstract system. As Australian care leavers Wilson and Golding have observed, the scrutiny of this official gaze may be experienced as a dehumanising form of surveillance. A UK independent review of children's social care also reported that care experience carries stigma, can weaken identity, and found that accessing care files can play a role in the lifelong memory and identity needs of care experienced people. The voices, experiences, and feelings of children in care are rarely heard in their records. Young people often don't know what has been written in the files and have no access to records management systems. In this way, social care record keeping reflects their broader experience of powerlessness and lack of self-determination over their own lives, an inequality which may have long-term impacts. The lack of voice is one of the most powerful symbols of the information inequality experienced by care leavers. As our care experience co-researcher John George said, one of the most profound things for me about the file, and it screams the loudest, is my lack of voice. I appear, my scrawled out writing, on page 52. My voice is totally stolen, and words are put into your mouth saying, this is how you feel. And at times, there's a conflict with what I believe. Another of our care experience contributors, Susan, on finally seeing her care records, expressed why these files matter. She says, I went through them and I read them and I was crying. I can't possibly explain how important those records were. It can put things away so that you can carry on with the rest of your life. You see, to them, it's just paper, words on paper. But to the person who's reading it, who it's about, it's everything. It's their life. Mirror has developed a set of principles for caring, record keeping, and child social care. The first principle is that care experienced people should be able to participate in every stage of child social care record keeping if they choose, including the creation of records, the management of records, and the provision of access to records at any stage in their life. Mirror's focus on the human person at the centre of the bureaucratic record takes us back to the importance of human relationships between citizens and the state in establishing and maintaining trust in those who govern us. In such ways, records and information management, record-keeping systems, and government data must reflect the needs and voices of citizens and not only the bureaucratic requirements of an abstract automated system. So I will conclude my paper this morning with a few reflections on how my experience, perspectives, and the learning from research in archives and records management, which I have briefly shared with you, might point to ways in which records and information management play a part in nation building. In this paper, I have described an arc in the relationships between records and information and citizens. First, records and record keepers facilitate the implementation of legislation and regulation designed to enable citizens' information rights. Access to information, whether in the form of archival records or current government administrative data, empowers citizens to interrogate lawmakers and hold them to account. A fundamental part of that is the legislation which establishes people's rights to information as citizens and balances out the natural information inequality. Information is an expression of power, and those who govern hold more power than the governed. Information access for citizens signals a shift of power from governors and lawmakers to those who are governed. Freedom of information legislation has also removed the old timeframes of archival records being made available for access after a period of time, typically 20 or 30 years, by enabling requesters to ask for access to current or recent information, bringing the scrutiny into the present, rather than only the historical past. Secondly, we have seen a big change in the nature of government information and records, from traditional paper file registry structures, mimicked by electronic record systems and digital file storage, which can be appraised and retained or destroyed according to traditional records principles. Now, most government activities, including e-government interactions with citizens, are carried out through digital transactional systems, which produce data sets rather than record-like files. Government administrative data are the evidence of those transactions, and in order to hold government to account, citizens need access to government data, not only government records. This change has many consequences, including the possibility of citizens having detailed, granular information about government almost in real time in large, complex data sets, in the context of rolling global news cycles and huge amounts of social media data. This enables greater transparency but also greater chances of mis- and disinformation. Record keepers are important in maintaining good records and ensuring accurate government data is accessible. Finally, in an abstract and increasingly impersonal world, with the COVID-19 pandemic further isolating and breaking social relationships, record keepers are important in returning us to human-centred records, enabling the voices of citizens, especially the marginalised and underprivileged, to speak and be heard. Ensuring that people's stories are heard, as we have shown in the Mirror project, is perhaps the most important contribution which record keepers can make to nation building. What is a nation, after all, if it is not about the people who energise and reignite it? Thank you for listening.